Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, where we'll be talking about crisis response and proactive risk management, the relationship between those two functions, and really how to get the most out of both of them in an integrated and holistic way. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Andrew Nicholson. For anyone who hasn't been to any of our webinars before, I'm the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Osprey Flight Solutions. We're a risk management and risk intelligence company provider for the aviation sector. With us today also, we have Matthew Borrie, also one of the co-founders of Osprey, and our Chief Intelligence Officer. And he will be looking at how we use proactive risk management and the tools and techniques that we use on that side of the equation of crisis response and proactive risk management. Just a few housekeeping points as usual. Of course, we're using Zoom, and I'm sure everyone's very familiar with Zoom. There is a Q&A button, of course, in the Zoom panel. Please do submit any questions that you would like us to look at, and we'll have some time at the end to answer any of those questions as they come up during the webinar. So without further ado, I will delve into the topics that we're going to address this afternoon. First of all, of course, we're going to look at what is risk management and crisis response from our perspective. Of course, we'll be explaining our definitions and how we perceive both risk management and crisis response. We're going to look at how we do it, how we use it, how we use our own products in both of those functions, and the process that we follow as an organization in terms of particularly risk management. We're also going to look at what operators and in fact the industry more widely can do to proactively plan and manage and mitigate risks, and how we feed into the crisis response process as well. Matt's going to take us through some situation examples to demonstrate this in a real life scenario. And then we're going to look a little bit about the essentiality of crisis response and how it's really integral to mitigating fallout. Talk about war risk premiums on the insurance side, and the need for 24-hour risk assessments. So those are the areas that we're going to cover this afternoon. And as I said, any questions, please do put them in the Q&A chat as we go through the presentation. Firstly, why are we discussing this afternoon? Why did we think that talking about crisis management or crisis response and risk management was something that would bring value to you, the audience? Firstly, we are unusual, I think, in the breadth of experience that we have as an organization, both in the crisis response and crisis management fields, but also, of course, in the risk management side of things. So being able to bring those two things together with the breadth and depth of experience that we have, yes, as founders, but also across the organization, I think means that we can bring a lot of value to that discussion and hopefully help organizations to look more holistically at these processes. Secondly, I think there's a need for us to recognize the gap that exists, that is being filled, but that can exist between risk management and crisis response. Historically, they have been, or on occasions, been perceived as quite separate processes and procedures for and functions for an organization to follow. But really, we need to close that gap. We can't just sit around and wait for something to happen and then deal with it through a crisis response process. Thirdly, of course, and we all know this all too well, the current risk landscape is extremely challenging. We're seeing increasing disruptive events, some large-scale major conflicts around the world, which makes avoiding disruption, particularly with the impact that it's having on airspace, makes avoiding that disruption even more important. And just as a quick view, again, we all know this, some of the events that we've seen just over the last few years, from the conflict between India and Pakistan in 2019, through to the Niger coup in July and August, and of course the current ongoing tensions and conflict in Israel. And clearly there's a large number of disruptive events that can have a major impact on operations globally. And finally, we believe that there can be a much better cohesion between crisis response and risk management. They can be mutually supportive as two different functions within an organization to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts, as we say. And I think that's an important thing for us as an industry to strive towards, to make our operations more effective and more efficient. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to firstly talk about what I mean by crisis response, crisis management, business continuity, but risk management as well, and define those terms so that as we go through the webinar this afternoon, everyone will be clear with what we're talking about. So crisis response, first of all, crisis response, as we see it, is a set of tools, procedures, processes, and tactics that are used by an organization, that are predefined by an organization to deal with an emerging crisis. A crisis might be external or internal, but it's a set of processes, a really clearly defined set of processes that can be followed, and techniques and tools can be used to deal with that process and manage the impact of that crisis down as quickly as possible. That's really what crisis management and crisis response is there to do. It is inherently reactive. It is there to react to a disruptive event, and therein lies one of the challenges with crisis response, in that, in times of crisis, all of us, or at least the vast majority of us, are not operating at our optimum when we're in the middle of a high stress, high tempo crisis environment. And that is exactly why crisis response plans or emergency response plans are put in place, to try and remove that uncertainty and trying to limit the impact that the crisis itself is having on our ability to deal with it, to make decisions accurately and in a timely fashion. So I think the inherent reactiveness of crisis response is an important factor to take into account. Risk management is very different, of course. Risk management is about identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and mitigating risks before they occur. So it is identifying the likelihood and impact of potential disruptive events in the future and mitigating those events so that either the disruption is minimized or avoided completely. So it is inherently proactive. It is all about looking forward. Risk management is all about identifying things that may happen in the future. And it is all about uncertainty. At the end of the day, risk management is all about understanding the likelihood of a potential event happening and the impact of that event. So it is all forward-looking before disruptive events occur. But on a practical base, or from a practical perspective, what does that mean? So a couple of graphs here just to try and visualize what it is I'm talking about here. So if you look at this graph, we've got disruption up the y-axis, disruption or cost, and time along the bottom axis. And at the intersection of those axes there, at the bottom left-hand corner, that is a disruptive event occurring. And the impact of that disruptive event increases very quickly to quite a significant level over that time frame. Now, of course, as soon as we as an organization, as a team, identify that a disruptive event has occurred and that we need to deal with it, there is a decision to implement an emergency response plan, a crisis response plan, as quickly as possible, with the whole intention of being able to manage that crisis, to be able to minimize the disruption and cost of that disruptive event. But of course, it takes time, even from a crisis response perspective. Even if we've implemented a well-established crisis response plan, it takes time for that action and that process to kick in and to have the impact on the disruption, the cost that it needs to. And therefore, as an organization, we will suffer the impact of that disruption, the cost, for that period of time until the crisis response plan really kicks in and starts having an effect on the disruption effect of that event. Now, if we can move that action point left, and this is where, well-established, well-practiced, well-defined crisis response plans come into play. If we can move that action point left, then of course we dramatically reduce the impact of that disruptive event and the cost to us as an organization, disruption to us as an organization. Now, as I said, well-practiced, well-rehearsed, well-established and proven emergency response plans, crisis response plans can help to do with this. But what helps even more is being able to understand that this disruptive event is possible in the future and have mitigating measures already established, predetermined, so that they can be implemented very, very quickly in response to that specific disruptive event. And that's the risk management side of it. And of course, ideally, what we'd like to do is move that disruptive, that action point as far to the left as possible, even to before the disruptive event has happened. So we have an understanding, we have a high level of confidence of the potential for a disruptive event to happen, and we can make decisions before that point in order to avoid it altogether and reduce that the impact of that disruptive event down to zero. So hopefully that's explained what I mean by risk management as an inherently proactive, forward-looking process, and crisis response, emergency response, crisis management, which is an inherently reactive component. Now, both of these functions are vitally important. Not for a second am I saying that either one of these things is unnecessary because the other one's so good. The point is that both of them are necessary, but they can each support the other side to increase efficiency and effectiveness in implementing, particularly crisis response in the case of a disruptive event. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Matt, and Matt's going to talk about how we particularly look at risk management as an organization and the process that we follow. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. And we'll discuss now some of the processes behind how Osprey conducts its support to gathering data from a wide variety of sources and putting that through phases of the risk management process. Part of being able to conduct effective proactive risk management is being consistent and utilizing a variety of not only human expertise, but technical tools to create the best possible picture of the global aviation risk environment. You can see that's in the center. Our day-to-day end state at Osprey is having the best available picture of what's going on globally that has an impact on the aviation operating environment at countries within airspace and at airports. We start off by collecting a wide variety of publicly available information and open source data from over 200,000 sources in a variety of languages. We do this in a way that gathers this into a pool of data points, which is then filtered and categorized as well as geolocated by our proprietary AI and machine learning tools. What this does is it cleans up all of this information that has been collected. And since it's geolocated, categorized, and filtered, we now can apply it to the global aviation operating environment. And this is where the interaction between our technical tools and our human expertise comes in. Once we've done this collection, filtering, categorization, geolocation, and we're looking at the global aviation operating environment, we can do risk identification within individual countries in specific pieces of airspace and at any given airport. Part of this is identifying trend and pattern activity through anomaly detection. Why is this important? we all know that activity's happening at different airports and in countries and in airspace globally. Some of this activity happens in similar ways from a day-to-day basis. So, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we understand that there's going to be missile launches from one country into another from certain portions of an airspace, for example. If that happens on a day-to-day basis, the trend or pattern is that it happens in these locations. However, when a new location is identified, being able to see that happen and know that something new is taking place in an area where it hasn't before, or in a way that it hasn't before, or in a frequency that it hasn't before, is very useful for the risk identification piece, because it leads directly to risk analysis and the application of human expertise. Being able to identify trends and patterns via data analytics and also via anomaly detection through artificial intelligence tools is only part of the story. You need to analyze those pieces of data that have been identified in risk identification with human expertise that can then take the wider context. Does this apply to only a certain geographic area for an airspace or a country? Does this apply to one specific airport or a collection of airports? Have we seen similar types of activity happen in other countries or at other airports in the past? How have those situations been dealt with? And then we're able to do things like proactively forecast whether or not we expect trends or patterns to persist, how the impact of those activities can disrupt aviation operations, and then what measures operators could take to minimize their exposure to the hazard, the threat, the disruption that is taking place as a result of that activity. The key is you can do this for every environment, from airport, airspace, country, every situation that develops from a conflict zone perspective or a social unrest perspective, for example, and for very specific airport operations into complex environments that may be perceived as high risk, or more benign environments that may be perceived at low risk, though low risk never means no risk. Each individual flight operation needs to be looked at in a comprehensive, holistic, and continuous way. And that's what the Osprey process tries to achieve. It takes the same approach over and over and over with a proprietary risk assessment methodology that looks at risk identification, risk analysis, predictive intelligence, and the output of that being our risk assessments via country, airport, and airspace, with mitigation measures that can be used to minimize disruption to operations. I think the key piece here is this fits into a number of Osprey products. So most of what's on the left is used by Osprey internally. Our ability to collect information and our ability to filter and categorize and geolocate is tools that Osprey has for use with its analysts. However, our digital model of the global aviation risk environment and the output of our risk assessments for country, airports, and airspace is a product that's available to our clients through our report functionality. Our risk identification, trend and pattern detection via anomaly tools, and data analytics is part of our Squawk and Explore offering to clients. Our human expertise and risk analysis capabilities are key components not only of our alerts, as well as some of our report functions, but also our Osprey Oracle tools. And then the predictive intelligence through our forecasting, as well as the integration with your flight schedules and flight operations, are part of our Pulse and Sentinel solution. So while some of this is internal to Osprey on the left of this diagram, much of what's in the center and to the right is a product offering, but it's also used by our analysts internally as well. So individual analysts lean on each other for human expertise. Our analysts use our Squawk and Explore data analytics tools, and all of our forecasting is done in a collaborative effort between our team, and the end result is a very useful set of tools for our clients. I think I'll hand it over to Andrew now, and he can kind of talk through the entirety of the risk management process and how Osprey fits in.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, there's an overview of how we do it and the areas of support that we can bring. What I've got up on the slide now is this is our risk management process, our methodology, but it is the ISO 31000 methodology. If anybody's seen or used ISO 31000, hopefully you'll recognize this. It is directly mapped across from our risk assessment methodology as well. And I think there's a couple of key components that I want to pull out of this. The first and most important for me is that this is a sequential process. And what I mean by that is that in order to conduct a risk assessment, you have to go through the risk identification, then the risk analysis, then the risk evaluation before you can treat any of that risk and apply mitigation measures. And what that means is that actually errors become compounded. So errors in the risk identification become compounded in the risk analysis, and then further compounded in the risk evaluation as further errors creep in those parts of the process. So this has a kind of dual impact. It is both a risk and an opportunity here, where if you can't get your risk identification right, if there are gaps in the risk identification, then the rest of the process becomes limited in its value. The risk analysis and the risk evaluation are going to be undermined by a lack of risk identification or poor risk identification. But likewise, if your risk identification is extremely good, then errors in your risk analysis and risk evaluation become less of an issue because they're less compounding of errors that are earlier on in the system. So that means that that early stage, that risk identification, identifying what risks exist in the locations that you're operating, within your business, all those risks becomes the most important part of a risk management process or risk assessment process. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is really I hope what Matt covered a little bit in his section is how do you actually do this from a practical perspective? And this is the challenge, because conducting a risk assessment process, it is an iterative process. It requires that it is repeated whenever there is a change in the environment, and these changes happen all the time, that it is continuously iterated, done on a regular basis, to understand how the environment's changing, understand if the risks that exist in that environment have changed or moved, or there are new risks that have emerged in that environment, and then feeds through for your analysis, your evaluation, and then how to mitigate those risks going forward. And that can be, if the right tools aren't used, it can be quite a burden. And one of the challenges around improving risk management as a function across the industry is finding ways to do this in a much more systematic, much more dynamic, much more scalable way, so that it doesn't add a huge amount of burden every time we want to take a step forward in our risk management processes. And that is why automation and data is an essential component of all of these aspects. Not only does it improve the quality of risk identification and remove remove subjectivity and improve the objectivity of that risk identification. And again, we as humans, we're all subjective in our outlook of the environments in which we operate. So data allows us to remove as much of that subjectivity as we possibly can. So I think scaling it and making it more efficient and effective is really an important part of what we're doing. And that, again, really, hopefully, what Matt demonstrated in his section there was that really, why we set up Osprey and what Osprey does. And from a pure technical perspective, our platform probably fulfills about 70% of the requirement of a comprehensive risk management process like the ISO 31000 process that's in front of you there. Now, organizations will have to do the other 30% themselves. I mean, we we can't do everything for an organization in terms of risk management, but there are areas that we can help. And Matt talked about Osprey Oracle, which is the ability to have a direct access to one of our analysts to support in specific risk management processes or specific risk assessments, very, very bespoke to a particular organization. And that's where we can start to fill that the rest of that 30% that organizations have to cover. But again, going back to that systematic things like, when I say systematic, what I mean is conducting a risk assessment of every single flight operation. Doesn't matter whether that operation flies from London to Mumbai or Minneapolis to New York. It doesn't matter. Every single one of those flight operations should be risk assessed, to be able to identify where those risks are, analyze those risks, and identify whether mitigation measures have to be applied in order to manage that risk down to an acceptable level. And doing that in a systematic fashion, automated fashion, and Matt mentioned Osprey Pulse. Really, that's where we do that, through the automatic risk assessment of every single flight operation that an operator can conduct. Just as an example, I think this is a good quote from Vincent from IFOA. Really our tools are about saving time and making things more efficient. The time saving benefits, the way that we can consolidate lots of data streams into a single reliable stream of information, which eliminates the need for this exhaustive data research, and it allows teams to focus more on strategic decision making and risk management, which optimizes operational efficiency and effectiveness. What I'm going to do now is hand back to Matt, who's going to talk about some specific case studies and examples in the real world to demonstrate where this has been effective. Matt, back to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to Vincent for a very complimentary quote. I think it highlights some of the key pieces here about time saving and why that's so important, because global or international flight operations are dynamic and situations can emerge and ongoing situations can change with very little notice. And so having as much accurate, actionable, intelligent, timely, accurate and actionable intelligence in a proactive manner helps the decision-making cycle, especially in situations where time is compressed. As we've seen over the course of the last couple of years, there's been several major conflict zone incidents that have disrupted the aviation operating environment in specific regions and even had global impacts. One of the things that I found interesting when Andrew was going through that ISO 31000 risk management process was, when you think about the risk identification piece, how useful technology is in those types of situations, especially at Osprey. And we look at this Israel-Gaza case study. You see the first thing on these slides is just the green line, which is the data that Osprey is collecting, and so we can see what type of activity not only is happening specifically, but in total on a daily basis, and what looks normal and what looks doesn't. The thing that I find the most useful here, though, are the white triangles, which are the Osprey squawks. Those are anomalies detected by our AI system. You see those first three squawks in the lead up to the Israel-Gaza conflict, which has been ongoing since the 7th of October, happened when there was no discernible significant increase or significant decrease in activity. When you hear about crisis response, you typically hear about the escalation, and you can see the escalation where the crisis started, obviously. But you're seeing that tipping point of escalation happening on the 6th and the 7th of October, right? But the Osprey anomaly detections via artificial intelligence were happening weeks ahead of time when there was no discernible escalation. This is a key point here. We're talking about risk identification being enabled by technology. What comes next are those forecasts, which you can see after the first anomaly detection, which is the analyst using the tools of technology with the expertise to then forecast a near-term event of rocket fire. You can also then see, after some additional AI anomaly detections, some critical alerts being sent related to the type of activity that's taking place. So when you combine these pieces together, it doesn't always have to be a dramatic increase in activity that precipitates a crisis. Many times those crises accelerate in a 24 to 48 hour time period, whereas with the tools that Osprey uses and the analytical expertise that we combine those technology tools with, you can understand the changes in the operating environment days and weeks ahead of time. And so this Israel-Gaza conflict, it's the October 21 or 2023 case study. We do have a separate white paper that you can access on our website that we issued in August of 2023 because we had proactively identified in 2021 and twice in 2022 significant escalations in the Israel-Gaza conflict in this same exact way. So in August, we were already talking about our ability to proactively identify change to give operators an optimal amount of time in decision-making space to mitigate their exposure to conflict zone impacts to their flight operations. Andrew, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll talk about another specific conflict. So another recent one from the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, you can see anomaly detections from our SQUAC tools happening weeks in advance of the Azeri military operation into Nagorno-Karabakh in the disputed border area with Armenia. You can see critical alerts being issued for significant activity and a forecast warning that a war was likely within 6 weeks that was issued at the start of September, and just weeks later, the conflict zone situation emerged. Again, what you're not really seeing anywhere on these slides as well is any type of government regulatory information, except for a single advisory and update from one government. You don't see anything until the actual conflict erupts, and 24 hours into the conflict, we saw Azerbaijan issue a NOTAM for its own airspace. So if you're expecting a government to give you the information you need beforehand, those things typically don't happen. It was documented on the Israel-Gaza slide prior to this that there was no proactive government warning. And in this case, very little was done by governments to provide aviation operators with the understanding that a conflict was likely to happen. So again, this is just another example of AI anomaly detection leading the Osprey analysts in risk identification. The risk analysis takes place, and we provide our clients with a very specific understanding of the change in the operating environment. We provide a forecast of when we expect a war to happen, in this case, what we expect the impact to do, and then a time frame from when we expect it to take place to help the planning process. We're not saying that we're going to mitigate the risk for you. What we're saying is we expect this to happen in this time frame, in this location. If you put a plan in place for that disruptive event happening, when it does occur, we will alert you that it's happened, and you implement your plan, which probably is just part of your risk management program and not crisis response, because you're not stuck in the crisis. You pre-planned for that event through a comprehensive risk management program and avoided or minimized the disruption to where you're only activating crisis response plans when absolutely necessary. And then we'll use our oldest example for this type of discussion around the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Again, Osprey started to understand a change in the aviation operating environment 4 months ahead of time, before the Russia-Ukraine conflict started. Through the anomaly detection, we were issuing alerts regularly throughout the lead up to the conflict. We raised our risk rating from low to moderate to high to extreme, all ahead of the conflict starting. And we changed our assessment of likelihood from a realistic possibility of a war by 31 March to a likely war by 31 March, weeks ahead of the conflict starting, and in the hours leading up to the invasion of Russia, prior to Ukraine closing its airspace, prior to Russia starting strikes and before any government had issued any type of restrictions on Ukrainian airspace, Osprey had already advised our clients to defer flights over Ukraine or to Ukraine airports subject to an operation-specific risk assessment. Again, this is the case study of these three situations. There's many more that we could go through. We've been able to use this approach for large scale unrest, very similar outcomes prior to what occurred in Sri Lanka in early 2022, prior to the Brazil elections in the summer of 2022, as well as around the coup in Niger, a similar coup that took place in Gabon more recently. Osprey was ahead of the curve on forecasting disruption and allowing operators to have, again, increased decision space to make optimal choices about their flight operations to avoid or minimize disruption to their business. I'll hand back over to Andrew now to kind of talk through some of the interchange between risk management and crisis response, and why having access to reliable, proactive risk management is just as, if not more important than, a refined crisis response plan.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and just one point before I move off the slide, one point I wanted to make, which I think these three case studies highlight really well, is it's not about being able to make a decision as quickly as possible. It's about knowing when that decision point has to happen. Knowing when the last safe moment is to be able to maintain operations to a point that they are still safe, but it's time to make an operational decision to change that operational model. So knowing when the decision point has to be is a critical component. And is only possible through these sort of automation and data-driven approaches to risk management. So when we look at the two functions we're talking about here, the crisis response and risk management, how do we combine them? Can we combine them? Do we combine them? And how do we get the most out of those two functions? I think a better question, I guess, than can you combine these risk approaches is really a statement that in order to get the most out of it, you have to combine those risk approaches. Integrating both of those approaches, both the crisis response and a proactive data-driven risk management approach, is the way to get the best results, to minimize disruption, to minimize the impact on an organization. Because fundamentally, proactive risk management can support a better crisis response. As I said at the beginning, crisis response is this set of tools and techniques and really a process and procedures that you follow in the case of a crisis. And you're never going to be able to avoid every single crisis situation. Proactive and predictive risk management allows you to do that to an extent, to a large extent, and avoid as much of that as possible. But crisis management is still an essential technique. It's still an essential function that needs to be rehearsed and established and proven. But one of the key things, as I said at the beginning about crisis response, one of the challenges with it is that when you're in a crisis, we humans, when we're in a crisis situation, it's not optimal for making decisions for most of us. So some people are very good at making good decisions in crisis scenarios, but for most of us, high tension, highly dynamic situations like that are not optimal for making good decisions. So the more you can know about the environment, the more you can know about the situation, what's happening, the background behind it, the better placed you are to firstly, inject that level of calmness and consideration, but also to inform the decision making that makes your crisis response more effective. And that's what proactive risk management allows you to do. Even if it hasn't been, you haven't been able to avoid that disruptive event, you may have put some mitigation measures in place already that reduce the impact of it. But as importantly as that, it gives you the information and the support that you need to make properly informed and effective decisions at the right time when a disruptive event or a crisis occurs. So we've talked a lot about risk management and a little bit about crisis response. And again, I do want to say that crisis response is still an essential component of operations. It is still an essential function for any organization to have developed, to have practiced and rehearsed, to change and adapt as that rehearsals and practices highlight gaps and challenges that in that plan. It is an essential component because no matter how good your risk management is, you're not going to be able to avoid every single crisis. And again, hopefully you'll have put in place some mitigation measures to reduce the impact of that crisis, but you're not going to be able to avoid it. So having an effective crisis response plan, which is practiced and tested and proven, allows you to minimize the impact of that event. And of course, the existence of a crisis response plan is a mitigation measure in itself, and therefore is part of that risk management process. And also in that the difficult times when things are a bit chaotic and stressful, it ensures that the allocation of resources in terms of the crisis response team or emergency response team and the focus on dealing with that crisis is exactly as it should be in order to deal with that crisis effectively. And whilst it's all very important, as I said, our aim in terms of proactive predictive risk management is to minimize the requirement for that crisis response, to firstly avoid disruptive events and those crises altogether, but also then to, as I said, apply mitigation measures that minimize the impact of that event. So go back to risk assessment again, of course, and I mentioned this before, risk assessment is a constant. It needs to be a proper, effective risk management process is an iterative process. It is continuous. It's got to happen all the time as the situation changes, as the environment changes, as new risks emerge, as other risks disappear. And the risk management process, the risk assessment has to be continuously updated for it to be an effective risk assessment process that feeds then into an effective crisis response plan. And as I said, if you follow a purely human-based approach to risk management, this can be quite a burden and require a lot of resource. And the application of technology in the right places in your risk management process is exactly what is needed to make it efficient and scalable, to minimize the burden, and to actually make it more effective in terms of the identification of the risks and the analysis of those risks through the process. So really, in all of what we've said, really is all about the essential nature of a proactive risk management approach in everyday work anyway, and then of course prior to a crisis type scenario, to be able to avoid or mitigate that crisis, the impact of that crisis. So being able to go through that process proactively, identifying those risks, analyzing the likelihood and impact of those risks, evaluating the risks and how they impact you as an organization, and then applying those mitigation measures through the an ISO 31000 type approach allows you to not just make decisions faster and implement mitigations faster, but to know exactly when to do those things. And it is, as I said, all about knowing when that decision point is, knowing about when you need to implement that mitigation measure, which could be quite expensive and in itself could be disruptive to your operations, but applying that at the right time to minimize the impact on your organization. Again, I've talked about the automated assessments 24/7, to minimize that manual process of identifying and analyzing every single risk, which is a tough job. We've mentioned a few times about predictive intelligence helping to mitigate the need for activation of crisis response. And I do just want to, as I said at the beginning, just touch a little bit on insurance, because there has been quite a significant change in the insurance market. Certainly hull war premiums have increased dramatically over the last couple of years, driven by conflicts like the invasion of Ukraine, and the impact that that had on aviation, particularly the confiscation of aircraft within Russia, and of course incidents like or conflicts like Sudan, where there was a significant number of aircraft damaged on the ground. All of these have had quite a significant impact on insurance premiums and the cover that is available. And there's no doubt that going forward we have seen a shift towards insurers requiring organizations to have more effective data-driven risk management processes in order to support the cover and the transfer of risk from the operator to the insurer. So that covers all of the content. I just want to touch briefly on the key takeaways that we've covered. Again, as we sort of do the last couple of slides here, please do put any questions that you have in the Q&A box if you'd like to ask anything, and we'll touch on those when we get to the end of the session. But key takeaways here. Look, we all know this. Risk isn't going away. Risk is a constant, is a permanent aspect of every part of our lives, and the environment that we find ourselves in as an industry, with the levels of disruption and conflict that we're seeing globally, I can't see that calming down in the near future, and we've got to find ways to manage and deal with that in an efficient and effective way. And that's what proactive risk management, a real sort of data-driven, technology-enabled, proactive risk management process, which provides that more time to action, more time to know exactly when that decision point is and what decision needs to be made at that time, to make that mitigation as efficient and effective as possible. And we've talked about war risk premiums a little bit there. And we are seeing this move towards a standard requirement to have the tools in place to mitigate the risk, or to at least to understand the environment in which you're operating more broadly. And going back to the crisis response thing, to make both your risk management and your crisis response as effective as possible, they need to work together. It's not one or the other. These two things need to be a holistic approach to dealing with the risks and then the manifestation of those risks through an emerging crisis. And if you can get them to work together in a really seamless, integrated fashion, they will be much more effective and much more efficient. And the impact on an organization is much reduced. And really, technology is an essential component of that. It is there to help to get ahead of these risks, to help to understand them, to help mitigate. And of course, as a bonus, it really enables that scalability of the process to allow that and enable that iterative, continuous risk management process, which is essential for that to be an effective process. Just a quick slide, just to show some of the organizations who we do this for, and then that is it. That finishes our content for today's webinar. I'll check to see if we've got any questions up in the question section. But please do click on the QR code, find out more about us. And in fact, earlier on in the presentation, the webinar, it was a QR code to download. We wrote a white paper which covers similar content to this, to the webinar as well. So please do have a look at that. That's on our website as well. So please do have a look. So far, no questions have come through. We've got a very informative thank you from somebody. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I hope it was informative for everybody on the webinar today. So I'm just going to watch it for the last 30 seconds. So if you go,
we have a couple hands raised.
Yeah, so if there are hands raised, if you could just type your question into the Q&A. We don't have the ability to let you speak right now, but if you could type your questions into the Q&A panel, then we can address those. So we'll give a couple of seconds for people to do that if they'd like to. But meanwhile, whilst I did forget to say this at the beginning, of course, it is International Civil Aviation Day today. So it is it's a good time to reflect on how we as an industry, particularly considering the theme of this year's International Civil Aviation Day is about innovation, and of course innovation in risk management, crisis response, and in better ways of understanding the environment that we're operating in to be more efficient and effective. And of course, most importantly, to keep our people safer and more secure is an essential part of what we do. So an appropriate time, I think, on International Civil Aviation Day to consider that. So one of the questions has just come through: where are your timelines available? So some of them are available in case studies and articles that we have on our website. Some of them available for our clients through our system and the resources in the system as well. So, but if there's a particular timeline that you're interested in, please do reach out to us and we'll get it across to you. And thank you very much for the request for an internship. Please do send us an email through our info email on the website, and we can have a chat about that. So last question just came through here. When you're talking about crisis, chronological, didn't talk about recent crisis, which is actually very important. As Osprey, what kind of precautions do you take for the Israel-Palestine situation? It is, I mentioned the Israel-Palestine, and I'm going to hand over to Matt to cover this because he's obviously the expert in this particular area. It is an important one. It's been, it's clearly been massively disruptive to the industry, and terribly tragic in every way. And again, I think today's is an appropriate time to consider and take stock of that. Matt, I hand over to you to talk about Israel, Gaza, particularly Israel Hamas.
Sure.
At the moment.
Andrew, if you want to go back to the timeline slide on it in the webinar, I can go kind of highlight maybe some of the discussion points around when it really started and then what we've done since.
Let me just. Okay.
So we did go through this earlier in the webinar. The precautions that Osprey took, we advised airlines in the weeks leading up to what occurred on the 7th of October, prior to the Hamas attacks into Israel, that rocket fire and drone launches into southern Israel were likely to take place. We have utilized our ability to proactively forecast those types of events in the past, as we did in the situations in 2021 and 2022. However, this situation in October 2023 was different than those situations that arose in 2021 and 2022. What was different this time is, as I discussed earlier when we went through the case study, is there was a very flat level of activity happening in the weeks leading up to this. Though Osprey's anomaly detections and forecasts were still able to give some clarity to operators that the situation, while it may have appeared normal from a day-to-day activity perspective, was not the same as what we had seen in the weeks and months prior, which is why we issued a forecast, and which is why we said that the rocket fire and drone launches into southern Israel was likely in a 2-week period. The advice to operators at that point would have been to take stock of their current flight operations, ensure they have an understanding of what to do in the event of rerouting of their aircraft if rocket fire extended further beyond southern Israel or drone launches took place deeper in. Now, I'm not saying we forecast the entirety of the conflict that's erupted. However, we did give advance warning that the situation on the border between Israel and Gaza was tense, and that kinetic acts like drone launches, rocket launches, and associated Iron Dome shoot downs were likely to occur. That forecast ran through the 9th of October. Obviously, the attack happened on the 7th of October. What we did in the immediate aftermath of these attacks, I'm talking within an hour after these attacks started, we raised our risk levels for the airports in the countries, as well as the 3 different airspace risk areas we have for Israel. Again, this all happened before Israel had even issued a NOTAM on the conflict itself. We then issued 2 more additional alerts in the hours after the initial start of the conflict, A, to highlight the changes in our risk ratings, and B, to highlight the fact that the Israeli NOTAM had been issued as well. So what we can do is we can give you foresight in the lead up to a conflict starting. What we can also do is help you respond very quickly when that crisis actually does start, so that when you're implementing your crisis response plan, after this large-scale terror attack, for example, had occurred, you're getting injects of actionable, timely, and accurate information to that crisis response team so that they can make the right decisions at the right time, as Andrew pointed out. What we've done since the 7th of October, I believe we're on update number 117 for our alerts related to Israel. That doesn't include our alerts related to Iraq and Syria, which have a connection to the conflict in Israel. I believe we're up to update number 25 in those areas. We've created a new airspace risk area for the Red Sea, south of the Israeli city of Eilat through the Gulf of Aqaba, due to the Yemen Houthi missile and drone launches and associated shoot downs there. And we're on another update string for those types. So probably 150 alerts, 50,000 incidents in our database in 60 days. So like almost 1,000 incidents a day are being verified and input into our system. So what that means is we believe we have a refined understanding of the aviation operating environment over Israel related to the conflict in Gaza, but also the wider region as well. So Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan, Egypt. We're constantly looking at those analytically with our team of experts, but our system is monitoring for change there 24/7 through the use of technology and anomaly detection tools. Hopefully that provides some insight on more of our follow-on to the crisis that erupted due to the Hamas attacks from the 7th of October, but more so the context around the lead up to how we helped operators have some foresight on the increased tensions there prior to the Hamas attacks.
Thanks, Matt. Just one other thing I wanted to mention. Obviously, the situation in Israel is extremely difficult. And whilst we're seeing activity going up and down, and the levels of activity, and of course we had the ceasefire for a while, activities really resumed up to pre-ceasefire levels after that happened. But I think one of the real differences in this situation from previous escalations in that tension between Israel and the border Palestinian state is the number of fronts that Israel are having to deal with really right now, because of course it's not just Gaza and Hamas, it is Lebanon, it is Syria, it is now Yemen and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, plus other nations like the US and UK with military forces in the Red Sea, all tied to the same situation. The complexity of that environment right now is immense, and of course, risk is an assessment of uncertainty. Likelihood is uncertainty, and so therefore, the level of uncertainty of what's going on and our ability with confidence to say, what all these different actors and these different fronts are going to do in the future, drives the level of risk up quite significantly. So it is quite a different environment from anything we've seen in that area for a long time. I've got we are coming to the end of the time now. We've actually come to the end of the time. There was one question about forecast notifications and where you can find them. Please do click on the QR code there and get in touch and ask about forecast notifications, and we can give you some more information about them. One last question: can you recognize and filter possible bots? The answer is yes. And if you want more information, please do give us a shout. Right, we've come to the end. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. I wish you all the very best. Stay safe. Happy International Civil Aviation Day. Take care, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much indeed for attending. Thank you.